Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. I want you all to acknowledge the shared purpose that brings us together, that every child in our school feels that they belong, that they are valued, and that they can thrive. As we discuss today's core topic, and I invite you to think about Luca, a student with low vision and ADHD, who is joining our school community. This multimodal presentations allows all of you to see, read, and listen to my ideas on how we can make inclusion not just an aspiration, but a live reality of every learner. So, what is inclusive education? It is not simply about placing a student with a disability in a mainstream classroom. It's about reimagining the system so that diversity is recognized as normal and celebrated as a source of strength. The UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability is clear in Article 24. Every person has the right to education without discrimination and on equal basis with others. Also, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child echoes this through Article 28 and 29, reminding us that education not only be free from exclusion, but must nurture each child's personality, talents, and cultural identity. With QET and Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, neglect, and exploitation of people with disabilities stresses on systemic reforms through removing barriers in the mainstream setting to promote togetherness and learning for all. As Luca joins our school, it's perfect time to think about what true inclusion is. Historically, education for students with disability progressed through four phases: exclusion, segregation, integration, and finally inclusion. For decades, learners were denied access to mainstream schooling altogether. Segregated settings emerged in the mid 20th century, offering special education but still isolating students from their peers. By the 1970s and 80s, integration became more common. Students with disability were physically placed in mainstream schools but expected to adapt the reverse, that school adapt to the learners. Inclusion is not about presence, it's about participation and belonging. Australia's shift was influenced by key international frameworks, notably the Salamanca Statement, which shifted our perspective, shift to a right-based view, asking schools to adapt to learners rather than asking learners to adapt to inflexible systems. Inclusive education underpins various principles to assist equitable access and participation for all learners on the same basis, adjustment in accordance to the learners, and challenging barriers such as gatekeeping, where access to mainstream learning is unfairly limited. The Royal Commission on Disability Discrimination Act explicitly prohibits such practices, describing them as discriminatory forms of exclusion and ableism, the tendency to view disability as a deficit. It often manifests through lowered expectations or assumptions that students with disability cannot achieve at comparable levels. What grounds this shift is a clear line from human right philosophy to educational policies. If we take time to look at these policies, we can clearly see that they reflect social model of disability, which shifts attention away from individual impairments and towards systemic barriers that restricts participation. Importantly, in Australia, these global commitments translated into national enactments like the Disability Discrimination Act and the Disability Discrimination Standard of Education, forming the ethical and legal foundation of inclusive schooling. Each step from the Alice Spring Declaration to the Australian Disability Strategy has deepened our collective responsibility to ensure every student can participate and belong on the same basis as their peer. Let's take a pause to give a reading time and know about what Alice Spring is. What does Article 24 of US Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability says, and how the Australian Human Rights Commission and Royal Commission calls help Australian government to ensure equitable and policy-abided curriculum. Turning to the why now questions about closing our segregated unit, this isn't only a pedagogical preference, it's a human right requirement. The DPOA argues segregation breaches equal participation rights and typically arises where mainstream inclusion has not been properly resourced. The Disability Standards for Education also found persistent policy practice gap. Rights exist on paper, but uneven implementation, weak accountability, and variable resourcing mean many learners still experience barrier. Their conclusion actually strengthens the case for closure. It's not enough to keep a unit open just in case. Instead, we must build capacity in every classroom and ensure the standards are enacted through clear roles, data, and monitoring. That way, inclusion isn't dependent on a few specialist rooms or people. It's the culture of the whole world. My statement strengthens the National Consistent Collection of Data on School Students with Disability, Australian Curriculum, Student Diversity Guidelines, Disability Discrimination Act, and Differentiation and Inclusive Pedagogy. On this slide, not only on national or school level, even on global level, we support that there should not be segregated units and must have inclusive classrooms. Take time and have a read on all the principal implications for school and some of the famous frameworks. The UNICEF Convention on the Rights of the Child from the Article 28, 29, 12, and 13 strengthens my statement for having inclusive classrooms rather than segregated units. Finally, from a social justice perspective, framework like Catholic social teaching emphasizes human dignity, the common good, and preferential care for the vulnerable. These values align with the closure, segregation, and building one system for all rather than parallel system with unequal expectation. When students learn together, communities become more equitable, compassionate, and cohesive. Social justice principles such as equity, participation, dignity, and respect. Let's talk about the stakeholder perspective. Inclusive education only works when the ecology supports it. Bronford Benner's bioecological model reminds us that Luca's experience is shaped by multiple systems, from the classroom and partnership between home and school to policies, funding, and public narratives. Our role is to align these layers so they reinforce Luca's participation and agency rather than work against it. The family school partnership framework names 7 dimensions we can act on: communicate, connect learning, build identity community, recognize family roles, consult on decisions, collaborate beyond school, and participate. In practice, set up regular two-way communication, connect classroom routines with home strategies, co-design IEP, and explicitly recognize parents' life expertise. Parents' research voice matters here. Shows caregivers often feel they must fight for mainstream inclusion and sometimes receive messages that they and their children are not welcome. And adds when teachers come willing to learn, partnership flourish, and students with sensory impairment experience stronger participation and confidence. More importantly, student consultation is not optional. Under consultation is an ongoing obligation. Emphasis should be given on comprehension, agency, and consent. We explain adjustments in accessible ways by building informed structure and transparent communication, considering linguistic, cultural, and accessibility needs, and maintain records of agreed adjustments and actions. By learning about other stakeholders' perspective, we see Luca what works for him, remove barriers proactively, and seek informed consents as supports evolve. This honor Luca's dignity and make supports more effective because they are with him and not to him. Let's learn about Luca's impairment now. Luca's learning profile gives us a clear picture of how impairment interacts with environment, not ability. He experienced low vision, which means a permanent reduction in sight that cannot be corrected with glasses or surgery. This affects how he perceives written information, visual distance cues, and detail, but crucially, it does not impact his intelligence or capacity to learn. For Luca, the main barriers are visuals rather than cognitive small text on the board. Inaccessible diagrams or poor lighting can restrict his access to information. With accessible resources such as enlarged print, tactical graphics, and appropriate lighting adjustments, these barriers can be eliminated. Alongside this, Luca has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, a neurodevelopmental condition that affects attention, organization, and impulse control. Students with ADHD often face difficulty sustaining focus during lengthy or repetitive tasks or may be easily distracted by noise and movement. However, these students also show remarkable creativity, curiosity, and divergent problem-solving skills when learning environments are structured and predictable. For Luca, effective inclusion means clear visual instructions, breaking information into smaller chunks, providing movement breaks, and embedding routines that supports executive functioning. Moving about talking barriers in learning. Luca experienced multiple barriers in learning: visual, cognitive, environmental, and social. His low vision affects access to visual information, while ADHD impacts attention and organization. Overstimulating environments and misunderstanding from peers or staff further limit participation. Removing these barriers enable Luca to learn, belong, and thrive inclusively. In the classroom, Luca might face barriers that affect his learning and participation. Visual barriers including difficulty reading small or low contrast text, noisy clustered environments, and rigid routines restrict focus, while misunderstanding his needs can lead to social exclusion. While we consider both conditions together, the focus is not on the impairment, but on the interactions between the learner and their environment. Research consistently shows that barriers to participation arises from rigid teaching design, inaccessible materials, excessive sensory load, and unstructured routine rather than the student's condition. Our roles as teacher is to design learning so that Luca needs are anticipated from the start. This means adapting task, tool, timing, and teaching environment. The 4 design level to inclusive pedagogy research. For Luca, reducing visual clutter, ensuring strong color contrast, providing oral explanation, and maintaining consistent routine will help him engage on the same basis as his peer. The goal is never to reduce challenge, but to remove friction, enabling Luca to meet the same learning intention through accessible pathways. Let's talk about some inclusive strategies and frameworks. As I discussed before, these are some of the visual requirements or some strategies that can help in achieving the goals for Luca. Let's talk about pedagogies. When we think about how to include Luca, it's not about changing him to fit the classroom, it's about reshaping the classroom to fit him. Inclusion means proactive planning for diversity so every student can access and engage with learning equitably. For Luca, this involves ADHD strategies, whole class inclusion practices, using universal design for learning. We design for variability right from the start. We engage students through purposeful choice and collaboration. We represent information through multiple modes like enlarged print, audio, and tactical graphics, so we support expression through oral, digital, or creative responsive. These principles ensure Luca low vision or attention challenges never limit participation. When paired with high impact teaching strategies, explicit instructions, scaffolded modeling, timely feedback, and metacognitive reflection allows Luca to gain structure and agency. Using a multi-tiered system of support, we can balance universal, targeted, and individualized adjustments, ensuring inclusion is systematic, not situational. Furthermore, both Tomlinson differentiation model and Mager's model of curriculum differentiation align strongly with inclusive practice of focusing on learner variability and responsive pedagogy. Tomlinson's encourage teacher to modify what students learn, how they demonstrate, and how engagement while understanding a topic. This is done through knowing four differentiation elements of content, process, product, and environment. This model ensures that students have meaningful pathways that respect readiness, interest, and learning profiles through scaffolding. Maker model complements this by extending differentiation through curricular depth, complexity, abstractness, and creativity, ensuring engagement and challenge for diverse learners. When applied together, both of these models plays a powerful dual role in balancing accessibility with intellectual stimulation. Rather than segregated units, let's go for a modification in our teaching. For Luca, inclusion begins with access that empowers independence. Have some go to look about for some modification that we can use for Luca or some other students in our classroom who are having low vision. For his vision, two key adaptations make learning equitable. First, Braille and tactical literacy offer real-time access to written information through traditional Braille text or refreshable Braille displays. Second, tactical graphics and raised line diagrams turns visual data charts, maps, and graphs into touch-readable formats through embossing or 3D printing. Next, Sense Early Intervention Vision Services is really helpful for a school to adapt best practice in supporting children with low vision. For Luca's ADHD, inclusive adjustments rely on structure and flexibility. Visual timetables and task chunking provide clear expectation and manageable step, while immediate feedback reinforces success. Short movement to sensory breaks, flexible sitting, and calming spaces sustain attention and reduce anxiety, supporting engagement for all learners. Digital materials should remain uncluttered and pair concise visual with oral instructions or 10-to-10 speech options. These practices maintain rigor while removing barriers. I would like all of you to pause and reflect on some of these two modifications and how we can implement them in our classroom. Talking about some of the key insights from the ADHD, the Australian Clinical Practice Guideline emphasizes the importance of predictable classroom routine, clear and explicit instructions, and minimizing environmental distractions to enhance students' focus and engagement. ADHD Australia highlights that meaningful inclusion occurs through active consultation with both students and their family, ensuring that adjustments are co-designed and responsive to individual needs. In addition, LD Explained advocates for differentiated instructions that incorporates visual schedules, scaffolded learning tasks, and explicit learning goals to maintain attention and motivation. In responding to parents' concern that Luca's inclusion may distract from the learning of other children, it is essential to affirm the inclusive education benefits all learners. In fact, as Tomlinson and Moon emphasize, differentiation through adjustment to content, process, product, and environment ensures that every student achieves shared goals via equitable pathways. Under the Disability Standard for Education, on the same basis, signifies that students like Luca are comparable opportunities and choices, such as Braille material, structured routine, and way of demonstrating understanding without compromising the learning experiences of other peers. Research demonstrated that inclusive strategies grounded in framework like UDL, HITS, and MTSS enhances engagement and participation for all students and not only those with additional needs. Inclusion, therefore, is not about lowering expectation, but also about designing environments that adapts to learners. To conclude my today's presentation, I would like to quote the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities quotes, remind us education is a fundamental right and true inclusion is realized when empathy, fairness, and courage guide everyday teaching practice. By embedding these principles, classroom became spaces where every child, including Luca, can learn, belong, and thrive together. Thank you.